Okay, guys, I'm assuming everybody can see my screen okay, and we'll go ahead and get going. What I'd like to do now is we've done this a couple times now, and we're going to start off doing this the same way as we've done the last couple times. And for those of you who are new, I'll give you a very brief introduction, and that is the main focus of what we're trying to do here is learn. We're trying to learn what it's like, in a nutshell, to disciple someone. And I know that sounds like a big task. However, over the last 10 to 15 years, that's been kind of my mission in life, is to figure out what in the world does that mean. And so we're just going to jump right in and do it and tell stories about it. I found that is easier than trying to teach it. If we experience it and relate to it with real life situations, it seems to connect a lot easier. So number one, as a quick review, everything is based on this concept, which is Romans 12:2 tells us to be transformed by renewing our minds. And so T stands for thoughts, E stands for emotions, and A stands for actions. And so if transformation is going to happen, it's going to happen by us changing what we think, and then that changes what we feel, and that changes how we act. So if we want to change how we act, then we go backwards, and our goal is to change how we feel by changing what we think. And when Romans 12:2 says be transformed by changing the way you think, basically, or renewing your mind, the direction we're taking here is not just
muted.
Okay, I think you just lost me there for a minute. Am I back? Brent, can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, good.
You're back.
All right, sorry about that. Okay, so let me do it. Brent, let me do it on my end here real quick. Okay, Brent, everybody's muted except me and you, okay?
There we go. Yeah,
So
if anybody has, again, when we get to a question, all you have to do is hit that little hand button and I can unmute you. Okay,
perfect. Okay, so Romans 12:2, we were talking about, this is the direction we take here, thoughts to emotions to actions. And the first thing we do is we identify the unhealthy emotion. And the reason we do that is Galatians 5 tells us the fruit of the Spirit, we'll go to it real quick. Okay. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, etc. The deeds of the flesh are these kind of things: envies, jealous, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, etc. So this is how we take our spiritual temperature, is right here, is to identify the unhealthy emotion. And then then we identify the thought that's creating the unhealthy emotion. If the thought creates the emotion, then we identify the thing that's causing these types of things over here to occur, right here. And then 3, we move that thought into a thought that's true. And then the step 4 is to renew. In other words, drench our minds with this true thought versus this thought that we're thinking that's causing the unhealthy emotion. So that's the deal in a nutshell, and why we do it that way. Again, the most important thing to remember is that when we have the identifying of the unhealthy emotions is because we want to take our spiritual temperature. We know these things can't be coming from God if they're unhealthy. we also know that this thought that we're thinking that's causing this unhealthy emotion to occur cannot be coming from God. And instead, it's got to be coming, and it says here in Galatians 5, the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are, etc. Those things are not coming from God. These things are coming from the enemy. So the thought we're thinking is actually causing this emotion is also coming from the enemy. This is a lie from the enemy, which is making us feel so horrible. And of course, the actions out of that horrible feeling are not going to be healthy either. So what I'd like to do is practice this for just a few minutes, like we've done for the last few weeks. And I'm just going to write down here. If you would, just type in your little box or raise your hand, either way. And I just want to write down 3, let's say 4 unhealthy emotions you guys have experienced in the last week, 2 weeks, month, or whatever. So go ahead and type those in. And Brent, you can just let me know and I'll write them on the board.
Yep, as soon as you guys put them in, I'll read them up here. Okay, fear.
Good.
Somebody have another one? Anger.
Okay.
Anger, dissatisfaction.
Okay. One more.
Anybody got another one here? Need one more. There we go. Inadequacy.
Oh, good. Whoops. Let's get back over here. Inadequacy. Okay. Now what I want to do is I'm just going to take one of these. I'll take number 4, inadequacy. And what I'd like you to do is type in your question box or in your chat box a thought that makes you feel that inadequacy. And let's get a couple of 3 of these on the board. And you can raise your hand if you'd rather just shout it out, or you can type it in. And I'll give you a few minutes to do that.
Okay, the first one says, I'm a failure.
Okay, good.
Another one says, I'm not smart enough. So we have, I'm a failure and not smart enough.
Okay.
Another one came through that says, not performing at my job well enough.
Okay.
We had another one. I see someone around me who is better at.
Okay, the last one was about someone else being better than me?
Yes.
Okay.
At something.
Someone else better than me at something. Okay, so these are very typical thoughts that would be coming in. Hold on one second. Move me over. Brent, can you tell that I moved over now? Is your screen updated?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Good. Okay, so inadequate, here what we've done. Identify the unhealthy emotion. And then we've identified these thoughts. Now, here's the deal. These are all, none of these can be coming from God. They all have to be coming from the enemy because they're making us feel that way. So a better way of saying it, rather than saying these are lies, is that each one of these statements are based on a lie. And so our goal is to get through the process of saying, okay, wait a second, this thought is based on a lie, this thought's based on a lie. So we can move out of this unhealthy emotion. Once we figure out what the truth is, then we renew our mind on that truth, and then this process reverses. The truth then creates peace instead of a feeling of inadequacy, and then that feeling of peace moves us to healthy actions. Now, this is a harder question, but I'm going to try it anyways. let's say for a second that number one, the unhealthy emotion is inadequacy. And that leads to number two, or yeah, that's right. And that leads to and that comes from a thought that says, hold on, I'm going to erase this and start one more time. Okay. Here's the thought. I'm a failure. And we could add them all up here, but I'm going to say I'm a failure, not smart enough, and I'm going to add another one here, other people are better. Now we're going to call that the thought, which it is. Now that leads to this feeling of inadequacy. Now what I would like you to do is I would like you to think about, and this is what I would like to do now. Let's do 2 or 3 of these, but give me an action that would naturally come out of someone that you know. So you know someone that feels like, that thinks I'm a failure, that thinks I'm not smart enough, that thinks other people are better than me. They feel inadequate. And what I'd like you to do is tell me, what kind of actions have you seen, do you normally see out of yourself or other people who think this and feel this? So go ahead and type that in, or again, raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
See, someone said, don't try anymore.
Okay, yeah, they could, their action would be an inaction. In other words, they would do nothing.
Another one is withdraw from relationships.
Oh, very good. Withdraw from relationships. Can we do one more? You guys are doing good.
Give up on job. You give up on job or task.
Okay.
Give up and do nothing might be kind of close together.
Okay.
How about withdraw from God or avoid conflict?
Okay, good. Avoid conflict and withdraw from God would be another one. Anything else, Brent?
No, this is good. We got a good group tonight.
Yeah, great. Okay, so you see what's going on here. You're seeing that I'm a failure leads to a feeling of inadequacy, and then all of a sudden, for instance, let's just imagine for a second that somebody avoids conflict now, or withdraws from a relationship. This is very typical, and the challenge is that if you're in a relationship, for instance, with your, let's say you're in a relationship, well, just with your wife or your husband, and you see them withdrawing from your relationship. Let's say this number 2 is happening right here. Brent, I'll just ask you this, but if you are in a relationship with your spouse and with Kathy, and you find her withdrawing, what is your natural tendency in a relationship when someone starts to withdraw from you?
I mean, you begin to wonder, what did I do?
Yeah, you begin to, what did I do? What did I do wrong? What's going on?
What can I do to fix this?
Yeah, and usually what it leads to is stuff like, what they don't love me anymore. What are they? Is there something wrong with me? And this is really crucial, because this is the natural tendency is we can't even. Here's the thing, guys. Let's say that you wanted to create an environment, even with your spouse, where you wanted to help facilitate the growth of your spouse, and your spouse is withdrawing because she feels inadequate, and the reason she feels inadequate is because she thinks I'm a failure. If you're sitting there thinking to yourself, she's withdrawing, there must be something wrong with me, oh my gosh, she can't withdraw, that's not the right thing for her to do, I can't believe she's doing that to me. See, that's the natural human response many times to this kind of thing happening. But when we understand her actions are coming from her emotions are coming from her thoughts, now all of a sudden, we don't have to take these actions of withdrawal as some sort of slam on us. We don't have to be defensive. We don't have to rebel against what she's doing. All of a sudden, this gives us the opportunity to see into, wait a second, maybe there's something behind this action that she's feeling that's caused by something she's thinking that's causing this to occur. In other words, what it does in summary is It helps us move towards empathy in these relationships when we can see this pattern. Again, in our own insecurities, if we're feeling like we're a failure, if we're feeling inadequate because we're thinking I'm a failure, now all of a sudden if my wife withdraws, oh my, now I've got to defend myself. Now I can't engage with my wife because I'm so concerned about protecting myself. So you see how there's some interrelational stuff that goes on here in a very big way. In summary, though, the most important thing here is to see these connections of thoughts, emotions, and actions. To be able to understand what's happening here, this will help immensely as we move forward in understanding how to get into other people's worlds and how to help them and how discipleship works. So what I'd like to do now is turn the corner here. These are incredibly important exercises. But I was talking with a friend of mine, actually, when I say friend, he's a friend now, rather new acquaintance. And this is exactly the struggle that he was having, except it was exacerbated into something even more. Now, it came out of this feeling of inadequacy, but he actually was telling me that at this point it was despair. And so what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about, we're going to call him, hold on, let me get over here to the next sheet here. We're going to call this guy Dan, although his name is not Dan. So if you're Dan and you think I'm talking about you, well, then that's not going to be the case. But what happened is that a couple weeks ago, I met this guy, and he called me up and asked if we could get together. I want to tell you just a little bit about Dan. He is a guy. Well, first of all, I can tell you this: when I met him, he's got this humongous heart, and I don't know how else to say it other than that. I could tell on the phone when I was talking with him and when I met him in person. He just cares deeply for people. As he was telling me his story, though, he was talking with me about, well, first of all, he gave me a little bit of his background. And his background, he was from the West Coast. He'd kind of moved back into this area with his family. But he'd gone to, he's older now, but he had gone to Bible college, and then he'd actually got his a graduate degree in some sort of either pastoral something or other or Christian leadership. I don't really know. But anyways, this is not a guy who doesn't know the Bible. He clearly understands the Bible. In fact, he had been in the pastorate for quite a few years and is still called to be a pastor. But during the move, there was some, it sounds like to me there were some job changes and this kind of thing. Anyways, that's kind of the background of Dan. And when I was talking with him, he said this. I asked him, I said, well, what's the unhealthy emotion? And that's when he said despair. Now, here's the thing. Last week we talked about should statements. This week we're going to head a different direction. But I asked him what his thought was. And I just simply said, what is it that you're thinking that's causing you to feel despair? And here's what he said. He said, the thing that you need to understand, Derek, is that the reason I'm really meeting with you is because my wife has separated from me, and I think we might be getting a divorce. And I said, okay, well, what's the thought that's making you feel despair? And he said, I want to be with my wife and take care of her when she's old. All right. This is this kind of shows Dan's heart. Remember I told you this guy has this humongous heart. He really cares for people. This really does show his heart. And the thing I want to make perfectly clear is that a thought in and of itself isn't necessarily based on a lie. In other words, there's many people that could say this. I could say this, although I'd rather turn it around and say I want my wife to take care of me when she's old. But I have a feeling that she would want me to say that I would want to be with her and take care of her when she's old. But here's the thing. If this thought we know is a lie, there's no question about that. But you're thinking, well, how can that possibly be a lie? That sounds way too good. First of all, we know it's a lie because it's causing despair. Now, you could think something like this. If you thought this thought and it was bringing you joy, thinking about retirement, well, then this wouldn't be based on a lie. This isn't a lie in that moment. It's not based on a lie because it's not causing you despair. But when we're thinking something like this, it's causing despair. The reason it's causing despair, then we know it's based on a lie. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I thought this was a wonderful example to bring up tonight, because sometimes when you're talking with people, you're going to get these statements that somebody says, and in your mind you're going to say, well, if this thought is creating despair, how can it possibly be coming from God? Because God's truth does not lead us to despair. And you're going to get stuck. That's what I'm trying to say. You are going to listen. Somebody's going to go, I want to be with my wife and take care of her when she's old. And you're going to be like, that's awesome. You're not going to know what else to say. You're going to be totally stuck. And so what I want to do is give you, through these webinars, is give you insights on what do you do, if you can imagine, a pastor or a person that's been a Christian for 30 years and a pastor who comes to you and says, I'm in despair, and you're just talking to him as a friend, maybe over lunch or whatever, and he says this thought, and then all of a sudden you're just, I've seen, it's easy to say, just clam up. I don't know what to say. I mean, it sounds like that's a very good thing. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to kind of walk through this with me, and I'm going to show you exactly how I helped Dan. Now remember, everything that I was working with Dan on is something that you can work with other people on. But everything that I was working with, sorry about that. Everything that I was working with Dan on, you can work with other people on, but at the same time, these are things that you can apply directly to your life as well. So when we
I think, Derek, at some point, maybe too, we could write down, if you could, right beside despair, sadness and what the difference might be. Because obviously, sadness is not something that is necessarily unhealthy, because, we know that Jesus even grieved.
Absolutely.
We're talking about Lazarus.
Sadness is a very healthy emotion. And in fact, if Dan would be telling me that he was thinking that he's sad that he can't be with his wife when she's old, well, that's not an unhealthy emotion. And that may not be anything to do with being based on a lie. Brent, you're exactly right. But this guy is saying despair, and clearly by looking at his face, it was something way more than sadness. This guy was very distraught. And quite frankly, in the situation he was in, obviously, it's a very difficult circumstance that he was facing. Okay. So yeah, very good point, Brent. So here we go. What do we do with this guy? I wanted to kind of leave you in this thought just for a few minutes to say, what in the world do we do? How do we get out of this? Now, the first thing I want you to see, just like last week when we talked about should statements, there's cues in thoughts that people tell you that kind of give you an insight into what may be the lie. And in particular, this right here, these two words, is what I call the little lie. We didn't talk about little lies and big lies last week much, but the should statement is what I call a little lie. And I also, what I like to call the I want statements, I like to call those little lies. It kind of is just an insight into what maybe kind of tweaking the problem. So this is the first clue of what's going on. I want. So be on the lookout for this particular phrase, just like you would be on the lookout for should statements, because they can easily trip you up. Because the enemy wants you, as a person, like if you're Dan, he wants you to think there's nothing wrong with this statement, and he wants you to live in that despair. So what do we ask next to an I want statement? And this is going to come a little uncomfortable for many of us, but once you get the hang of it, it's really not that hard at all. He says, I want to be with my wife and take care of her when she's old. Most of us, when we hear somebody say something like that that sounds so good, we think we understand exactly why you would want that to happen. There's many reasons why you would want that to happen that would be healthy. But remember, Dan is thinking something that's causing him despair. So the why is very important as to what's going on with Dan. So I ask him the question, Dan, why do you want to take care of your wife when she's old? Okay. Well, it seemed on the surface that for a person that's a friend, a person that is listening to Dan, it just got worse, because he says, after he says, I want to be with my wife and care for her when she gets old, he then goes on to say, I want to keep my commitment and not break my oath. All right. All right. So it's almost like you know, if we weren't sure what to do with Dan before, now we really don't know what to do, because how can that be wrong? I mean, he wants to keep his marriage vows. He doesn't want to break his vow. He wants to keep his oath. You can see, again, where you're like, oh my gosh, you know, that's based on a lie? So what I did was the same thing I would suggest to you. You keep going. So, well, why, Dan, is it that it's so important for you to keep your oath? Why would that be important? Now, many of us, because of our own preconceived notions of what we think is right and wrong for us, right and wrong for him, what we would think in this situation, we would never ask kind of an empty box question like why. In other words, help me understand what you're thinking. Why is that important to you? In other words, not why is it important to me, not why is it important based on what I think or how I was brought up, but why is it important to you? And I asked him, I said, so why is that? And he then said, I don't want to disappoint my in-laws. Now, I need to tell you a sinful part of my life, and that is, if this was happening to me, this would be the very last thing that I would be thinking. Okay, because I'm sure there's been plenty of times over my 23-year marriage that my in-laws haven't really been a huge fan of me, and maybe you've experienced that, maybe not. But the fact of the matter is, I can promise you this, I don't want to disappoint my in-laws. If my wife was about ready to leave me, would definitely be the last thing on my worry list. However, I'm not Dan. And if we understood Dan's history and Dan's connection with his in-laws and how they had breathed into him and how they were connected, we would understand that this makes total sense. But now we have been able to gain insight into what's happening with Dan that we didn't have before, and we would never have had if we didn't get into his world and connect. So what have we done? We've identified the unhealthy emotion, which is despair. 2, he says, I want to be with my wife and take care of her when she's old, which naturally we would think there can't be anything wrong with that. But what we're doing is we're just asking a few questions so he can discover what's the real thing that's causing you to feel this despair. And so we're getting to the lie by asking these questions. And all we're really doing is we're from an inquisitive perspective, if we just be curious and get rid of our own ideas of what he should and shouldn't think, we have the ability to ask that why question to get to this. I don't want to disappoint my in-laws. And he actually went further. Even though this was the first time he'd ever really talked with me in person, he said, I don't want to disappoint my in-laws And then, of course, my next question was, well, why is that? Well, he says, you know, it would make me feel like that I really, if I let them down, that makes me feel like that I'm just not, and then he just kind of shook his head. And I kind of finished the sentence for him like you were just not good enough. And he's like, yeah, that's exactly right. I didn't live up. I just didn't, I'm just not good enough. Now, you're seeing what's happening here is that Dan was feeling this inadequacy that really extended into despair, but it was coming from this place that says, I'm just not good enough. I can't stand the thought of disappointing my in-laws and them thinking bad of me. If they think bad of me, that would confirm that I'm not good enough. So we made an enormous amount of progress in just really not very long, and all we're doing is this basic thing: identify the unhealthy emotion, identify the thought. With I want statements, the best way of being able to move people out of I want into something that they can identify that's the lie is to ask these why questions. It's very powerful. It's not hard.
Well, we all can identify to that whole thing of my performance plus, others' opinions equals my self-worth. I mean, it's something all of us buy into, and you can see exactly how he got there.
Yeah. Yes. There's no question about that. So now that we're at this point, though, I don't want to disappoint my in-laws. If I do disappoint them, then clearly I would feel invalidated. I wouldn't feel validated. I certainly would not feel good enough. And that's when we have an opportunity to really see and share with Dan this little lie that's here is I want. The bigger lie is that somehow he can get his validation from either performing well enough in his mind, him thinking he has to perform well enough to keep his marriage together, and if he doesn't, then he's invalidated, he's not good enough, or that his marriage has to stay together in order to feel validated from his in-laws. And so you're starting to see this connection between his thought and how he feels about himself as being good enough. Now back to here on the I want. As a quick side note before we finish this line of thought up, I want is clearly the oldest deception in the book. And when I say oldest deception in the book, I really do mean that. The I want statement, little lie here, is exactly what caused Adam and Eve their problem, is they wanted to be in a different position than they were in. They wanted to know more. They wanted something they didn't have. And an incredible, and so by definition, if you wanted kind of a biblical term for it, this is coveting. And the definition of coveting is when you want, sorry about that, you want what you don't have, or want to be who you are not. Okay? This, again, is an incredibly powerful, if you start thinking about your life, how powerful I want to be, I want to have what I don't have, or I want to be who I want. If you can think about the absolute tyranny, let me just say in my life, I can think over my life the huge tyranny that this has gotten me into. Now, for me, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a better basketball player. As I got older, I wanted to be a better businessman. As I get even older, I want to be better looking because I think I'm getting uglier. You can know that when you want what you don't have or want to be who you're not, it's going to create some unhealthy emotion. And this is exactly what's going on with Dan in many ways. Is he wants to do this, and he's connected this want with how good he is. And so what do we do next? Well, in this moment is where we get to share with Dan. Now, of course, Dan's a Christian, no question about that. And all I did was share with him exactly what I call the gospel, which is simply this: we're made up of a body and a mind and a spirit. Let me go over here real quick. 1 Thessalonians. Okay, here we go. Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you entirely, and may your spirit, soul, and body be preserved. So those are the three parts. Soul is in here. I also call it mind. This is also where your emotions are, stuff like that. But the core of who you are isn't your body, because your body dies. Your brain dies when you head into the coffin. But this part of us, this spirit part of us, is what lives forever. This is the part that is the real us. This lives eternally. It's living now, but it lives eternally. And here's the thing. God knows that we are born into sin. We can never seem to live up, and we fight so hard to be validated and live up that this whole Jesus dying on the cross thing says, when you believe, then I, the Holy Spirit, comes into your spirit. Your spirit, your old spirit, the nasty part of you is dead now, and I come in to live. I make you righteous, is what Paul says. Colossians says, I complete you. What this is saying is something very simple and very profound. If God comes into you to live, and Brent, we rank God from 1 to 10, what is he going to be?
He's going to be a 10.
He's going to be a 10. And so he is good enough. And now he just stuck himself in you, and you now have taken on him. So now what does that make you?
A 10.
It makes you a 10. Now, of course, the enemy wants you to say, oh, no, God comes into you, and you somehow make God less than a 10. He wants to make us think that, but it's not at all what happens. In Romans, we are told that God's Spirit, capital S, testifies with our spirit, small s, that we are children of God. He gives us his righteousness. Now, if you remember, I'm not going to go to all the verses tonight, but in Romans, we hear about this concept of the gift of righteousness. And this is exactly how it happens. When we ask God to come into our life, the Holy Spirit comes in. God is righteous, and he gives us his righteousness, and it's a gift from him because of our faith, because we believed. Put it that way. So our faith causes this to happen. Now, what does this have to do with Dan? Well, it has everything to do with Dan, because in this moment, the whole reason why he's living in despair is because he feels invalidated if he disappoints his in-laws. But the fact of the matter is, the truth is, as a Christian, what in the world can possibly invalidate him? What can make him less than? What can make him not good enough? If the God of the universe is in you, what can possibly make you less than, invalidated, not worth enough?
Yeah, nothing can. But the truth is, if he's thinking that he's not because he's not being good enough, then he's going to be held hostage.
That's right. So what's happening is he's thinking a thought that says, my validation comes from what my in-laws think, and what my wife thinks of me. That's the enemy coming out here and throwing this arrow at his head. And he says, and you know, like all of us, we get to choose in our minds, we get to choose what we're going to believe. We can believe for a moment, if we would like, that, okay, our validation comes from my in-laws, it comes from whether my wife stays with me or not. My worth and value comes from that. Of course, that's going to make us feel despair. However, the moment that we go, wait a second, or we think, wait a second, my validation doesn't come from them. My validation doesn't come from whether my wife stays with me. My validation comes from the fact, my worth comes from the fact that Christ is in me. Now let's see how this plays out in real life. Imagine for a moment that Dan wants to reconcile with his wife. And what we're going to do is we're going to go two different ways. This way, he says, because of my wife not wanting to be with me and my in-laws disapproving of me, I feel despair. Now, what did we do over here? Remember when we did this? Sorry, you guys you guys are watching this and your eyes are probably going crazy. Did what? What are you talking about? Let me find them. I got to find the screen here. Okay. It was here. Right here. Remember when I said, if your thought is I'm a failure and you're feeling inadequate, then your action is, and then you gave me these incredible actions that would come out of that thought and feeling. So now let's go back to Dan. The left-hand side, we're going to keep him in the lie. My wife and my in-laws are what makes me valid. They validate me. And if that doesn't happen, then I'm not validated enough. There's somehow a hole in here that needs filled. Again, I'm not suggesting that he even believes that his wife and his in-laws validate him completely. I'm just saying there's a hole in him he thinks needs to be filled with his wife and his in-laws. And then that makes him feel despair. Same thing we did before. But here's what I want you to do. Now, if you're, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take and write to Brent, if you wouldn't mind, or write down even on a piece of paper. Tell me about Dan at this point. Imagine you're married to him. Now, only do that if you're a woman. But imagine that you're married to someone like this. It could be your wife, too, that's saying the opposite. Let's say, imagine this person, and he's thinking, my wife and in-laws validate me, and now I feel total despair. Give me two actions that may likely come out of someone believing this lie that's struggling with, like if you're his spouse, that would be struggling, that Dan's struggling with. So one more time, I want to make sure I'm clear on this. Dan's struggling with this, you're his spouse. What would be the natural result you would see out of Dan if he's thinking these things and feeling despair? What would be a natural action you would see?
First one says withdraw from healthy communication.
Okay, so one thing he could withdraw, and what would be another thing he may do?
Control.
Control, perfect. I don't know who said that, but this is a dead on, guys. You're right on it. These are the two things that would happen. Now let me ask you something. Do you think for a minute that withdrawing and controlling is going to endear Dan to his wife and help the process of reconciliation with his marriage? Absolutely not. And this is more likely what I see than withdrawal, but they both are very common. So imagine his wife is struggling, they're separated, they've got issues going on. Now he thinks he's not valid anymore, which leads him to despair. So then he starts calling, yelling at her, screaming at her, telling her she ought to be a better Christian, telling her she ought to come back, telling her she needs to get her life together. Every time he's telling her all those things, that is controlling. And again, that's not going to be that's not going to give you any help at all. But this is exactly what the enemy wants. He says, oh, don't you want to be with your wife and take care of her when she's old? Yeah, I really do. Well, then, come on, you really need to get your life together, because imagine, here you are, a pastor, and you have marriage problems. Man, that means you certainly are not good enough. Again, I'm talking as the devil here, And he's like, oh, I know. I better call and try to get her to do what I want her to do. I got to stop her from doing what I don't want her to do. I got to control her. And the enemy goes, yeah, control her. Call her up. Control her. Well, of course, we know what happens. It just makes it worse. Now, his spouse definitely doesn't want to be around him. It exacerbates the problem. It creates all kinds of mess. Okay, now let's see what happens over here. He decides to think something different, which is, wait a second. Whether my wife leaves me or not, that has nothing to do with my value, nothing to do with my validation, nothing to do with how good I am. Nothing to do with that. Of course, the enemy wants to go back to that lie and say, that says my value equals my performance plus other people's opinions. He wants you to believe that every day. He's going to do everything he can to get you in the mode of thinking that. I understand that. But that's this is like the biggest lie in the entire universe. And this is what's happened. But he says, you know what? That's not the case. Whether my wife leaves me or not, my value is still set in stone. I'm still completely righteous. God makes me righteous. I can't make myself righteous anyways. I'm not that good. Hold on one second. Okay. So now we're back here. And he thinks whether my wife leaves me or not, my value is already set in stone. It was set in stone on the cross. Now, 2, do I have to feel despair anymore? No. Now, I may feel sad. I may feel peace. I certainly may not feel joy in that moment. But certainly sadness and peace is a whole lot different than despair. And having peace does what to control? When you're living in peace, your control can go way down. And when your control goes way down, now you have the ability to restore relationships. Okay, now one caveat here. Well, even if I did that, that doesn't mean my wife's going to come back. I totally agree. There is no guarantee here but that your wife's going to come back. But what I can tell you is this way of living is significantly going to enhance all your relationships. Whether you have a relationship in the future, whether you have a relationship with your kids or your friends, it all is the same stuff. Certainly there may be too much damage, or maybe your wife has issues that have nothing to even do with you and she leaves you. If that's the case, you still get to live in peace. Okay? She may be leaving you for issues that that had nothing to do with you. And if you're sitting here believing this lie, you're going to feel despair, and it has nothing to do with it. If it did have something to do with you, you get to learn from that. You get to still experience this peace because that isn't what validates you, which then moves you towards healthiness. So that's kind of the whole cycle here. We have the lie, the thought that we buy into, the validation that really comes. We've got the lie over here, and then the truth that we really believe. And when we really believe that and we renew our minds on this, it leads us to the fruit of the Spirit, and guess what? Then we move to healthiness. Now, even if we didn't move our actions to healthiness, even if we don't restore a relationship, there's still a humongous benefit here. There's a huge payoff. I mean, and the payoff is you don't have to stay up all night freaking out. You don't have to drink as much alcohol to forget about it, and you don't have to worry so much during the day about whether your wife's going to do this or that. It's incredible. Okay. So, Brent, I think, help me fill in the blanks as if I need to here, but I think we're just about out of time. But what I wanted to do was show how you can take someone through this lie of inadequacy. Move them through it, just like we did here. Identify the thought. Ask these why questions. See these little lies like I want. Move them. Then we move back, because the big lie is always this. The big lie, excuse me, I'm on the wrong sheet. The big lie is always this, and the big truth is always this. You're validated, you're completely righteous, you're completely whole, according to Colossians, not because of anything you've done. Now we can live out of that thought, and that thought sets us free from the despair, sets us free from being controlled, our emotions being controlled by what other people think of us, and how well we perform either at our work or at our marriage, etc. It's quite a paradox, actually. Brent, do you have anything to add?
You know, I'm just thinking about, you know, when you started putting down the I want statements, and then what he said was, I don't want my in-laws to think bad of me. That's still an I want statement.
Right.
And you could even go back to when he was saying, I don't want my in-laws to, you know, think bad of me or whatever it would be.
Yeah.
What he's, in a way, what he's saying is, I want to be a good Christian.
Yeah.
And as if we really had, when we understand that God is the one who is in us, and it's the Spirit that leads us into all truth, as if we really kind of had all the control to be able to do that, because God's truth as it's being revealed to us is what continues to keep moving us in that sanctification process. So I can see, boy, it can become a real slippery slope with people saying, I want to be a better Christian, for instance.
Yeah, well, first of all, let's look at what's happening here. To say I want to be a better Christian is quite an interesting thought, because the reason you're a Christian is because God is in you. Now, the reason you're going to heaven is because of God is in you. So this would be like saying, okay, Brent, I've got God in me and he's a 10. You've got God in you and he is, well, he's like a
6.
6, yeah, because, you know.
Yeah.
Because I'm a better Christian than you. And somebody might say, well, no, I don't mean like your declaration of Christianity. I'm talking about the way we live our life out as a Christian. Now, I could definitely be a better Christian if that's the definition we're talking about. But look at what's happening here. Who is causing this healthy response? Here we have an action. And it's a healthy action. It's not controlling. We have an emotion. It's peace. It's a healthy it's a healthy emotion. It's peace.
Yeah. It's coming from God.
It's coming from God's truth. It's not coming from you, so you can't take credit for it and start telling me that you're a better Christian. Okay? All right, so you make a great point.
That's big.
Yeah. Okay.
Someone asked a question on here,
yeah.
Derek. They just said, isn't the I don't statement predicting the future?
Okay, let's go back to that. I don't want to disappoint my in-laws. Yeah, it really is. And so you have, and this is very common, by the way, you have many times when you see a statement like this, you're going to see a statement with lots of lies in it. You can have one sentence with 7 or 8 different little lies. Here we have I want. That's certainly based on a lie. And here it says I don't want to disappoint. Well, you're predicting that you're going to disappoint them. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Like you have the power.
Yeah, like you have the power. And to make this point even clearer, Dan, when I was talking to him, even mentioned the fact that he actually wrote a letter to his in-laws, or had a conversation or some such thing, I don't remember, but he had some sort of conversation with him that says, he said, I'm sorry. Well, the reason he said he was sorry was because, of course, he decided that he totally disappointed him. Okay? But guess what the in-laws' response was? The in-laws' response to him saying they were sorry was, sorry for what? See, the in-laws were not disappointed in Dan. He just predicted that they were. So yes, there is that other lie in here. No question about it. Okay, anything else, Brent? We've got time, just a couple minutes for another question if anybody has anything.
Well, anybody got a, let me see here. Anybody else have a question? Steve, I think we got to that question you had typed on here when we did the thing about if God is a 10 and I feel like a 6. It doesn't really still make me a 6. I'm really a 10. Anybody else have a question on this? You can type it in here. We'll get to it.
Okay.
Or someone could ask a question, too. If they don't want to type it in, we could unmute them. It's always the... And again, if you have a question, you'd rather ask it, you can raise your hand electronically. Just push on the hand button and we can unmute you. Or maybe you've all left.
Is there anybody there anymore? No. Looks like they're all there. Let's hopefully this was beneficial. We're going to continue to go through these. What I'd like to do in the coming weeks, however, is I would like to get to the point where you write down your unhealthy emotion that you experience during the week. We all experience them every week. This is a battle, a daily battle. Ephesians 6 says it's a daily battle against the enemy. So this isn't something like, oh, I get it, and then all of a sudden I never have these unhealthy emotions anymore. It's a daily battle. Write down the emotion. Write down the thought. I would love to, next week or the week after, I would love to actually have somebody where you and I just go through this right here together. We'll unmute you. You and I can have a conversation. I will just ask you maybe the why questions, or I'll ask you whatever question would be applicable next, and kind of go through this practicing process to kind of discover what your lie is, discover what the truth is that could set you free from the lie that you're buying into that's causing the emotions that you're struggling with. So I'd love that. I'd love that if you could, you can email me directly and say, hey, Derek, I'd like to do that. Here's kind of what I'm thinking. Here's my emotion. Maybe we could do that on Tuesday night. Or just bring it to Tuesday night, raise your hand, send a little message to Brent and say, hey, I would like to do that this week. So be thinking about that. Also, I loved the emails that I got this week from you talking about how you implemented some of these things right into your life, right into your kids' lives, right into your friends' lives this week. It was extremely encouraging to me to hear how you are being able to connect like that. And hopefully this was beneficial as well. So the second thing is when you're talking with people and you're connecting with people, write down when you're talking with them, write down what their unhealthy emotion is. Write down what their unhealthy thought is. Even if you get stuck at that point, write those down. Bring them back to me. Bring them back to Tuesday night. Put them in an email and send them to me. We'll go through those, just like we went through the situation with Dan. Of course, we're not going to say their real names. We're not going to give the real information about them. We're not going to, breach any confidence. But what we can do is go through what is the lie and then work through the situation. Brent, do you have anything else to add?
No, I just look at this whole thing and what resonates with me as we work through this. We've all been taught we're supposed to be renewing our mind to be able to resist the devil. But this is what makes sense, because that scripture verse that says, therefore submit yourselves to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. The whole submitting yourself to God is really going back and finding out what is true. That's how we do this.
Right. And if you think that the enemy, if God is truth and the enemy is a lie, he's the father of lies, we're told in John, then resisting the devil is resisting those lies. And he does flee from you. I mean, think about it. If you are looking at this scenario where you start focusing on this truth, guess what happens to the enemy? He's got no chance against this. He has no chance against this truth that is, I'm good enough. Okay. Brent,
yeah,
could
he
you...
just caught the ricochet.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, Brent, could you pray for us and we'll be done for this evening?
Absolutely. God, thank you so much for your truth, because it is the core of everything. It's what we have to live out of, and it's what you've given us. God, help us to live from the inside out. Remind us every single time we just have something comes up that causes some type of an anxiety or fear or depression, that we understand that that isn't coming from you. And in those moments, help us to be able to take the time to stop, go to your word, find out how to do this with you, what is true about what you've said about us. Remind us that we are complete in you, and that we can do this life. And it really isn't by thinking about maybe how we did something in the past or tomorrow, but really it's right now, living in your truth and remembering who we are and whose we are. It's not what we say and do, but it really is who we are. Thank you, God, for these moments. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right, thanks, guys. We'll be logging off here in just a few minutes. I appreciate your participation and your input. And don't hesitate to email me or call me anytime. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
See you guys.